Buenas tardes. Gracias a Fundesa y ENADE por la invitación. Es un honor y un gusto estar en Guatemala, pero desafortunadamente voy a hablar en inglés y no tengo chistes. Okay. I'm going to talk about my book and some of the implications based on my very superficial understanding of the Guatemalan case. So here's the cover. And if I could explain to you what this book is about with one photograph, this is what it would be. It's the Korean Peninsula at night. And you can see there's a dramatic difference between North Korea and South Korea. South Korea is very bright. They have a lot of electricity, a lot of light bulbs. North Korea is very dark. There's a little speck of light in Pyongyang. Maybe that's the presidential compound. And that shows that reflects many things. But first of all, it reflects dramatic difference in prosperity and living standards. Life expectancy in South Korea is about 10 years higher than in North Korea. Income per capita is difficult to measure income per capita in North Korea, but it's probably 20 or 30 times higher in South Korea. So that has huge consequences for people's lives and welfare. And what's interesting about this photograph for a social scientist is that difference didn't exist in 1950. If anything, North Korea was more prosperous and more industrialized before the Koreans were split apart at the start of the Cold War. And what I like about this picture very much is three things. One is it's already showing you, I'm indicating the difference in living standards by thinking about technology, by thinking about electricity, by thinking about light bulbs. And I'll come back to light bulbs, as you'll see during the talk. But it's also sort of obvious to everybody what caused this divergence, what creates that difference between North and South Korea. That's because the economies are organized in very different ways. South Korea, starting in the 1950s, developed a market economy, a very dynamic private sector. North Korea abolished property rights. It abolished markets. It imposed a socialist-style economy. This is not a talk about capitalism versus socialism, and the book is not about capitalism versus socialism. What I'll try to convince you by the end of my talk is actually North Korea, while it might say it's a socialist country, the reason it's poor is the same as the reason every poor country is poor, which is that the way the society is organized, the way the economy is organized, the rules or the institutions, we say in social science, do not create incentives or opportunities for its people. That's why it's poor. And South Korea managed to create a set of institutions that did a much better job at creating incentives and opportunities for its people. That's the economics. But it's also clear from this example that behind economics is politics. Why did the North Korean economy get organized like that? Because the North Korean Communist Party decided to organize it like that. Okay? That looks like an extreme example. But again, by the end of the talk, I'm going to try to convince you that this is the story in all poor countries. It's the political construction of the economy that blocks incentives and blocks opportunities, that creates poverty and underdevelopment. This picture is also interesting from a social science point of view because it's very inconsistent what happened in Korea with many ways of thinking about prosperity in the world. This is not about cultural differences. Korea has a long history of unified state, culture, language. That's the same north and south of the demilitarized zone. This is not a story about geography. It's a story about man-made institutions and rules and the incentives and opportunities they create. President Morales was talking about this example, which we also use at the start of the book. This is the fence in between Nogales. On the right-hand side, Nogales, United States. On the left-hand side, Nogales, Mexico. Again, two places, very similar geography, very similar culture. If you've been to Nogales in the United States, it's a very, very Hispanic city, but very large differences in prosperity and in basic public goods and public services. On the left of the fence, Nogales has an enormous problem of crime and illegality and violence. It suffers from massive underprovision of basic public goods. Of course, the difference in living standards between Mexico and the United States is much smaller than the difference between North Korea and South Korea, but it's still enormously significant for the people living there. So, why is it that Nogales, by the way, this is an old photograph, so I'm sure President Trump is going to build a much bigger and fancier fence. There's a fence here, but it's a small, weedy little fence. I'm sure there's going to be a much bigger, more exciting fence, eventually. Let me talk about what is it that creates these higher standards of living to the right of the fence, okay? And I'll do that by talking about the world's richest man. Sometimes things go up and down. Bill Gates. What did Bill Gates do? Bill Gates was an innovator. Bill Gates was an entrepreneur. He invented an operating system. He revolutionized the computer software industry. He made a huge amount of money. But the big story here is that he sucked enormous amounts of talent and capital and energy into the computer industry. He actually created far more wealth than he himself could benefit from, because many people built on his ideas and his innovations. Why did Bill Gates become an innovator? Because that's where the institutions pushed him. He started a business when he was an undergraduate at Harvard. Okay? That's how you become successful in the United States. You become an entrepreneur. You start a business. The institutions created the incentives for him to do that. He became enormously rich, and they created the opportunities for him to do that. They brought the legal environment so he could start a company, so he could enforce contracts, so he could borrow capital from financial institutions. All the institutions supported that. Okay? What's he doing here? He's swearing to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. This is actually a photograph of when he appeared in front of US antitrust authorities, and Microsoft were found guilty of violating the Sherman Act. Okay? So, that's interesting. The institutions pushed Bill Gates into innovating, into starting a business, but he still wanted to be a monopolist, It's a natural thing. I was telling people this morning, I'm an academic, We'd like to be intellectual monopolists. I hate it when people come with ideas that start competing with mine. I only want my ideas, It's human, okay? It's human. So if you want to support the institutions that push people's talent and energy into innovation, into creativity, you need to enforce those. You need to back them up. You need to ground them. And that's what US antitrust law did with the Sherman Act. It goes back a long, long way. Here's a picture from 100 years before that. It's a contemporary cartoon, and it's an octopus. But if you look at the head of the octopus, it's an oil drum. It's the Standard Oil octopus. The Standard Oil company was this enormous conglomerate that Rockefeller, probably the world's richest man at the time, started, just like Gates is. But if you look at the tentacles, you see the tentacles are wrapped around the Congress, they're wrapped around the White House. The Standard Oil Company was in the business of eliminating its opponents and seriously corrupting the political system. What happened to the Standard Oil Company? In 1905, it was broken up by antitrust authorities using the same legislation that was used against Bill Gates, the Sherman Act. So this is a long battle going way back into the 19th century, okay? But it's a crucial battle because it's a battle which the United States, albeit imperfectly, has won in the sense of pushing Bill Gates towards innovation, pushing the Standard Oil Company away from controlling the Senate or controlling the White House or being involved in politics, pushing it towards economic dynamism. Economists have known since the work of Robert Solow in the 1950s, the research for which he eventually received the Nobel Prize, is that what drives economic development, what creates prosperity is innovation. It's new technologies, new ideas, entrepreneurship, new businesses, new ways of improving human productivity, new goods, new services. It's creativity. That's what Bill Gates did. Bill Gates innovated. That's the key to success. He became an entrepreneur. He started a business. That's the key to economic dynamism. But whether or not your energies are pushed in that direction depends on the institutional structure of society. So, what is it about these institutions in the United States? I talked a little bit about Korea, North Korea, South Korea. You have an idea, well, there was socialism and maybe there was capitalism in South Korea. What is it about these institutions that created these incentives and opportunities for Bill Gates? Well, in the book, we have a language for talking about that. We say these institutions are inclusive. And I'm going to motivate that word. That word is very significant in our research by coming back to the light bulb. Here's the patent that Thomas Edison, who invented the light bulb, when he invented it, he took out a patent. Okay? A patent, Bill Gates has lots of patents. A patent was meant to protect his intellectual property rights. That creates incentives. Okay? When you come up with an idea, people can copy that idea. They can take your idea, and they can use that to generate wealth as well. So you benefit from only a fraction of the wealth you create by innovation. So the idea of a patent is to protect your intellectual property rights, to create better incentives for innovation. Okay? Now, the patent is a very interesting thing. It's in the US Constitution. It was stipulated in the US Constitution. And the first patent board that met in 1790 was thought to be so important that Thomas Jefferson was on it. Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, was on the patent board, deciding whether or not people's inventions merited protection. Okay? That's how important people understood this to be. Okay? And what's interesting about the patent is you come with an idea. You go to Thomas Jefferson. Well, not by Edison's time, but in 1790 you could go to Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson would decide, how innovative? Is this a new idea? Is this a really original idea? And then you all paid the same fee, and the government protected your intellectual property rights. So anyone could come with an idea. The government, you paid the same fee, the government protected your intellectual property rights. Ask yourself the question, who were these people? Who were these innovators? You know, who were these people who took out patents? Well, you can study that, okay? And the interesting thing is that what you see is that these people came from everywhere in society, all over the social spectrum. Poor people, elites. A third of people who took out patents in 19th century United States had no education whatsoever, okay? That's not a policy recommendation. I'm just saying ideas, talent, creativity are spread out everywhere in society. You don't know where it is. You don't know where that entrepreneurship is. It's latent. People with ideas and projects and dreams and passions. And what you need to do to have innovation, to have a prosperous society, is to create a set of rules, create a set of institutions which can tap into all that latent talent in society. And that's why this notion of inclusion is so important. You know, people ask me, I work in many developing countries in South America and Africa, and if people ask me, you know, one sentence, you know, why is the Congo poor, or why is Nigeria poor? I say, wasted talent. It's wasted talent, all that talent without a chance of coming to anything. So, inclusive economic institutions, they're institutions that create broad-based patterns of incentives and opportunity in society. That's what they managed to create in South Korea. That's what they managed to create historically in the United States. What's the opposite of that? Well, the opposite of that we call extractive economic institutions. Extractive economic institutions are economic institutions that impede incentives and opportunities. Think about what Bill Gates was trying to do. You know, Bill Gates was trying to create a monopoly. What do monopolies do? Monopolies stop people getting into a line of business. They take away other people's opportunities. They take away other people's incentives. So monopoly is a great example of extractive economic institutions. Here's another example. You heard that I teach every summer in Bogota at the University of the Andes. This is a photograph I took out of the window of my classroom while I was teaching last summer. Okay? It's a barrio next to the university. It's called Peninsula. It's what they call in Bogota an invasion. Okay? So it's an informal settlement. People just took other people's land. They came, they started building houses, they occupied somebody else's land. The university would like to buy the land to expand. But how do you buy land from people who have no title? If you start trying to have a discussion with them, then the question comes up, well, who did own the land when you occupied it? And as soon as that discussion starts, everything is over. So this is an enormous problem in every developing country that I know. Very ill-defined property rights. Nobody has a title. As the work of Hernando de Soto suggested, that creates enormous impediments for entrepreneurship. You can't use the property as collateral for a loan. It has many other consequences. So this, I would say, is another example of an extractive economic institution. It undermines the ability of people to use their talent and ideas and restricts their opportunities. Okay? So now you, coming back to the Korean example, you see the difference between North Korea and South Korea. I said it's not about socialism and capitalism, and now we have a language for talking about the difference between North Korea and South Korea. Why is North Korea poorer than South Korea? Well, because North Korea has extractive economic institutions. They may take a socialist form, but they still have this property of undermining people's incentives and opportunities in the same way that ill-defined property rights or monopolies in Colombia have the effect of undermining people's incentives and opportunities. That keeps Colombians poor in the same way as socialist institutions keep North Koreans poor. But I don't want to emphasize capitalism and socialism. I want to say, look, the details of these societies may be different, but the reason they're poor is that they have these extractive economic institutions. Economically successful, prosperous societies have inclusive economic institutions. But you could say, this begs the question a little. Where do these things come from? Why is it that some countries have inclusive economic institutions and other countries have extractive economic institutions? Well, remember my little discussion of Korea. Go back and think about Korea. You can see that in that case, it's obviously related to politics. Okay? Where do systems of property rights come from? Why is it that people in Peninsula don't have a title to their land? Well, they illegally occupied it to start with. Nobody kicked them out. Nobody came and rationalized the situation afterwards. This is not, in the periphery. This is 2 kilometers from the Palacio Nariño, okay? So this is in the middle of Bogota. The government never did anything to legalize or formalize this situation, okay? Where do monopolies come from? Monopolies come from people giving the right to create entry barriers, to monopolize resources or economic activities. So just these examples I gave suggest that there is an analogy to the Korean case. This is coming out of the collective choice of society. It's coming out of a political process. So you could say the first layer of our book is to say, you know, what is it that makes for economic success or economic failure? That's inclusive economic institutions and extractive economic institutions. But lying behind that is politics, okay? So now I want to talk about that layer and the types of political institutions that are consistent with inclusive economic institutions and prosperity, okay? And a simplest way to start thinking about that maybe is to show you what are non-inclusive political institutions or extractive political institutions. And here's my favorite example. I don't know if you can read that. I'll tell you what it says. This is President Mugabe, who recently deceased, who was the president of Zimbabwe for 37 years. Long time in office, okay? You might know him as a very successful politician. You're thinking, well, anyone who could be president of a country for 37 years is an extremely successful politician. But what you probably didn't know is that he was also a very lucky man. Okay? Here's a story in the BBC about how President Mugabe won the lottery. Okay, how about that? He won the lottery, a national lottery. I don't know about Guatemala. You know, I'm British. In Britain, we don't have politicians who are that lucky. We could do with it at the moment. But here's President Mugabe who won the lottery. Why did he win the lottery? It's obviously fake. It's not that he needs the money. It's just to show how powerful I am. I'm so powerful, I can win the lottery. Okay? So what sort of political system, what sort of political institutions do you have in Zimbabwe? You have a rule by a one-party state called ZANU-PF. Okay? They've been in power since independence in 1980, and income per capita in Zimbabwe is about half of what it was in 1980. Actually, it's about the same level it was in 1960. So for 60 years, there's been absolutely no economic progress in Zimbabwe. Okay? Why is that? Extractive economic institutions, you probably know there's an incredible history of massively insecure property rights in Zimbabwe. Where do those extractive economic institutions come from? They come from extractive political institutions, and here's part of the story. The fact that the society is ruled by a very narrow elite who are furthering their own interests. So the first element of trying to create inclusive political institutions is you need to have a political system with accountability, where political power is spread, where the government is accountable to the people. That's what you don't have in Zimbabwe. But that's not the only thing that matters. The other thing that matters is the capacity of the state. And that's something that resonates for me a lot with this discussion of the liquid state and the solid state. So that's a big theme in my research over the last 20 years. Okay? What do I mean? What's a liquid state? Okay? What's an example of a liquid state? Here's an example. This is a part of the resignation letter of Senor Carlos Manuel Urzúa, who until the summer was President López Obrador's Minister of Finance in Mexico. This is his resignation letter. You can find it on Twitter. Let me just read something out that's underlined in red. Me resultó inaceptable la imposición de funcionarios que no tienen conocimiento de la hacienda pública. Okay? So, how would you expect the Ministry of Finance to function, to do its job, to regulate the economy, to help foster economic development in Mexico, if the government are appointing people who have no competence, Okay? So there's many reasons why states are weak, but an enduring theme in many parts of Latin America is the politicization of the state. There aren't clear rules and institutions that govern recruitment, promotion, the specification of functions. That's a key part, as I'll come back to right at the end when I talk about my own country of Britain, in building a solid state, building a state with capacity. Let me give you another example from Colombia. Oh no, I'm going to show you this just for fun. Something else about Mexico. No, I don't want to talk about tariffs or anything, but if you can see the bottom right, it says 2019. It's the year of the Caudillo del Sur, Emiliano Zapata. So in Mexico, they're still celebrating caudillismo, the Caudillo del Sur. So it's a very unhappy scene in my mind. Let me give you another example of extractive political institutions in terms of the incapacity of the state. Here's a Colombian example, okay? The evidence of Musa Besayi, former congressman and senator. Actually, when he was in the Congress, he was the most popular, and when he was in the Senate, after Antonio Navarro, he was the most popular senator in the entire Colombia. And he describes how President Santos's government divided the Congress people into A, B, C. And A, B, C were different groups depending on how good they were at bringing votes. So if you brought a lot of votes, you were an important congressman. And then he provides a list of all the government institutions you could appoint people to. Okay? So if you were a Congress A, you could appoint people to the Instituto Colombiano Bienestar Familiar, big government institution. You got to appoint people. If you were less important, you only got to appoint people to Incoder or Invias. Okay? So it's an incredible politicization of the state. There's no rules governing the promotion, the recruitment, the incentivization of people within the state. This is a liquid state. The Colombian state needs to be made more solid. In Mexico, it's going in the opposite direction. The state is becoming more liquid, not more solid at the moment. It's becoming deinstitutionalized, and you know what the consequences of that are going to be. So this is hard to talk about, but I think we know it's true. And it was true historically in Britain. It was true historically in the United States. It's true everywhere in the world. And building institutions is about depoliticizing institutions. It's about promoting merit and talent. It's about the same thing that we talked about with Bill Gates. Okay? It's letting people do their thing and use their talents to the interests of society and in their own interests. Okay. When I talked about the patent system, I mentioned something, and let me come back to emphasize it. It wasn't just that the United States passed a patent law and had a patent board. They enforced the law. They enforced your intellectual property rights. Remember Peninsula? I showed you that barrio in Bogota where nobody has property rights. Okay? Here's a certificate. It's the very first certificate that was issued after the passing of the Homestead Act in the United States. Okay? The Homestead Act was the act that opened up the frontier for homesteading. And it provided titles for every homesteader. Here's Daniel Freeman. He's the first person who filed to get a plot. It has extremely detailed information. If you've ever seen this, the Homestead Act made these maps. They had very specific plots. The details tell you which plot he got, in which township, in which state, 160 acres of land, okay? This is what people, this is the 1860s. This is what people in Peninsula don't have. Where does this come from? It's the capacity of the state. It's the bureaucratization of the state. The state measures, it grades, it produces maps. It gives people title. You have property rights. The state defends your property rights. That's what people in Peninsula don't have. That's what people in rural Colombia don't have. that has enormous consequences for economic incentives and opportunities. Okay? So to me, again, this is an example, you could say, of an inclusive economic institution, but I'm relating it directly to the capacity of the state, okay? To measure, to monitor, to record, to enforce, okay? Where does that come from? That's nothing magical. That comes from exactly what I've been talking about. Rules, incentives within the state, rules about recruitment, rules about promotion, incentives, esprit de corps, building state institutions. It's difficult, but many countries have done it. Okay, so now we're going to try to sum everything up with a diagram, which professors love diagrams. But let me just talk you through it. And when I've talked a little bit about the diagram, I'm going to ask, where's Guatemala in the diagram? Okay, so think of the world. There's poor countries and there's rich countries. It's much more complicated than that. But it's useful to just make that simple distinction to develop the argument. Okay? What is it about poor countries? Look at the horizontal axis. I don't think this would work anyway. Economic institutions, inclusive, extractive. Okay? On the vertical is political institutions, extractive, inclusive. So I'm tempted, probably I'll regret it. I'm tempted. Let's see if this works. Here, sorry on that side, but here, extractive. These are poor countries, North Korea, Mexico, I talked about Mexico, I talked about North Korea. They have extractive economic institutions. Of course, Mexico is not as extractive as North Korea. They have extractive economic institutions. Why? Because they have extractive political institutions. Here's rich countries. Here's the United States. Here's the United Kingdom, my own country. Why are they rich? Why do they have income per capita as they do? Because they have inclusive economic institutions underpinned by inclusive political institutions. How come they got those? Where did they come from? Were they born with them? No, they built them. They built institutions. They built inclusive institutions. Britain was a poor country 300, 400 years ago, and it developed because it built inclusive economic institutions that created innovation, that created entrepreneurship, it created private enterprise, it created the Industrial Revolution. Why did it do that? Because it created more inclusive political institutions. Okay? So what you could think of, and I'm going to discuss very superficially Guatemala because I'm not an expert at all. But obviously, poor countries are here and rich countries are here. So the problem of developing, the problem of taking Guatemala and making it what you want it to be, making it prosperous and making it successful, is moving into this cell of the matrix, moving into this situation with inclusive political institutions, inclusive economic institutions. How do you do that? How do you do that? Okay? Well, here we could talk about transitions. We could talk about how societies went from being extractive to being inclusive. And I'm going to come and talk right at the end, before I finish, about the British case, because I think that does have interesting things to say about the challenges facing Guatemala. But let me talk about China. People are usually very interested in China. And let me talk a little bit about Chinese economic growth. How come China has become so successful over the last 40 years? Well, the big picture is they became more successful economically because they made their economic institutions much more inclusive. In 1978, China was an incredibly poor country with extremely extractive institutions. It didn't have markets, it didn't have property rights, there were enormous regulation of prices, such prices that existed. There was no freedom of mobility. The Communist Party controlled or tried to control every aspect of people's lives. The story of Chinese economic growth is exactly that the Communist Party started withdrawing from that role. It started stopping controlling people's lives. They deregulated prices. They allowed farmers to make their own decisions. There was an incredible increase in productivity in the rural sector. In the 1980s, that started spreading into the industrial sector. So China went from a situation of extractive economic institutions to much more inclusive economic institutions, and growth rocketed. Okay. What do I say about that? There's a question mark about China. Well, from our perspective, China still has extractive political institutions. It's run by the Communist Party. Okay. It has a state which has a lot of capacity, which is very different from most poor countries, developing countries, but it's run by the Communist Party. What do I say about that? I say the history of world economic development shows that you cannot expect inclusive institutions to come at the diktat of a communist party or any type of party or dictatorship. Okay? You have to have accountability. You have to have participation. At the end of the day, it's ordinary people in society who have an interest in public goods, in infrastructure, in schools, in healthcare. Not the Communist Party doesn't care about that. The Communist Party cares about itself. So this is a particular juncture where promoting economic development happened to be in the interests of the Communist Party. What you see in world history is there's many moments like that. There's many instances of transitory economic growth without the right institutions. But it never lasts. Think about Argentina. You know, in 1920, Argentina might have been one of the 5 or 10 richest countries in the world. It was in the right place at the right time. Why has China done so well? It was in the right place at the right time. It had incredibly low wages. It could take and steal and borrow technology innovated elsewhere. Put those two together, you have very rapid productivity growth. They had hundreds of millions of people in agriculture producing nothing. They put them in factories. That generates very rapid economic growth. But Argentina never had the political institutions, or really the economic institutions, necessary to sustain that development and take Argentina and make it a really developed country. And neither does China. Okay? There are other paths. You might think, based on my discussion, that the emphasis is on building political institutions, building state institutions, moving from extractive political institutions to more inclusive political institutions. And I think that's right. My view would be, once you create an inclusive set of political institutions, then inclusive economic institutions are going to come. Okay? Inclusive economic institutions will follow as a consequence of inclusive political institutions. Do I think that because China created more inclusive economic institutions and has experienced very rapid economic growth, that in itself will create more inclusive political institutions in China? My answer is no. I do not think that, and that's not what the evidence shows. So that's not what the evidence shows. So let me talk a little bit about where is Guatemala here. I think this matrix is useful. If you think about it, you have to think, you think about extractive, inclusive, poor, rich. How do we get from here to there, if that's where we are? And that's a process of institution building. Okay? So let me talk about Guatemala. I'm happy to be contradicted. My knowledge and understanding is very superficial. Let me talk about political institutions in Guatemala. Okay? So I emphasized 2 dimensions of political institutions. I emphasized accountability and the distribution of power, and that I emphasized that element. And I emphasized the capacity of the state. And my impression is that there are very big challenges in both of those dimensions in Guatemala. Thinking about accountability and the distribution of power in society, I was very struck by this poster. I think President Morales has left now, but this is not a statement about him or his administration. It's a statement about what he had to do to become elected in a democratic system in Guatemala. And on the campaign poster, everyone knows the campaign poster, it says, "Not corrupt and not a thief." What sort of political campaign is that? Where are the policies? Where is the vision? Where is the, you can vote for me because I'm not corrupt and I'm not a thief. So when I saw that, I thought, this is not, I'm not saying anything negative about President Morales. I'm just emphasizing the moment where he felt this is what he had to say to become elected. Okay, that's the important point. That, to me, that's a statement about the challenges of accountability and democracy in Guatemala. Okay, and here's another picture which I think is about the state. Okay, this is the arrest of the former President Perez Molina on corrupt charges of corruption. I don't talk very much about corruption. I know everyone talks about corruption in Guatemala and all over the world, but let me stress a little bit how I think about this. To me, corruption is a symptom of an institutional failure. The corruption is a symptom of the malfunctioning institutions, the weak institutions in the Guatemalan state, the inability to enforce rules and procedures. That's where corruption comes from. So you can prosecute corruption, but that's not a substitute for having a real strategy for building institutions. And that's not just about judicial institutions, it's about state institutions, it's about many types of institutions in society. So I just want to emphasize that. So I would say, if I think about these two elements of political institutions I've been talking about, and I asked, where was Guatemala? If I was talking about Colombia, I'd say Colombia has extractive political institutions. There's lots of differences within that category, okay? I'm not saying Colombia is like North Korea. Obviously, it isn't. Colombia is a much better place for people to live in, much more accountable, much more hope than in North Korea. But they're both relatively poor countries. In particular, they're far, far, far below their potential, like Guatemala is. And I would say this and other evidence we can talk about suggests to me that Guatemala has extractive. If you're going to say, does it have extractive or inclusive political institutions, it has extractive political institutions. What about economic institutions? Well, earlier on, I was talking about the Sherman Act in the United States and the enforcement of the Sherman Act against Rockefeller, who was probably the richest man in the world at the time, and Bill Gates, who's probably the richest man in the world today. As I understand it, in Colombia, there is no, in Guatemala, there is no Sherman Act. There is no competition law. Now, in Colombia, there's very nice competition laws. I know the people who wrote them. They're not enforced, okay? So that's a problem of capacity of the state, too. Okay. So if I was going to put Guatemala on the diagram, lo siento, I would say it's in the cell with extractive. It's in the cell with extractive institutions. Okay. So, but think about it like this. I emphasized earlier, every country in the world that has inclusive institutions today had extractive institutions historically, and they built more inclusive institutions, okay? So that's a message of hope. But the book also suggests that's a political project. It's about politics, okay? So building more inclusive institutions is about building a vision of changing institutions, making state institutions stronger, making the state more accountability, deepening democracy and participation. It's a political challenge, okay? And that's something very important to understand. Here's a failed political challenge. Many of my friends were recently working for President Macri in Argentina. Here's the new president of Argentina, almost certainly from the Peronist party. President Macri had a lot of very good ideas about how to change Argentina, but he couldn't solve the political project of how to bring enough people with him. And the Peronists came back. So my emphasis is on politics, and so building institutions is about politics. You all know that. And so it's about creating a vision for how to strengthen institutions and how to build a coalition in favor of that. And at some level, that shouldn't be difficult. How difficult can that be? You know, if institutions improved in Guatemala, income per capita would rocket. There'd be so much wealth that everybody would be far better off. That is the big picture. That's the story in every country that's gone through economic development. There's obstacles, there's challenges, you know, and here's an example of the challenges couldn't be overcome. But let me tell you finish with an optimistic story in my last 2 minutes, which is about Britain. Here's another example about problems with the state in Guatemala. Guatemala is the Latin American country which has the smallest state relative to national income. Smaller than Paraguay, smaller than Ecuador. The government has no resources. Let me tell you a little story briefly about the emergence of inclusive institutions in Britain. What on earth is this thing? Okay? This is a creation of a modern fiscal system in Britain. It's the revenue rounds of Supervisor Cowperthwaite. Supervisor Cowperthwaite was a meritocratically appointed excise tax official. And this is from his diary, and it shows all the places he visited in Yorkshire over a particular period in the early 18th century. He went around monitoring, checking how much beer was being produced, how many loaves of bread were being produced by the baker, so he could tax them, collecting information, taxing, monitoring. This excise tax bureaucracy was created 1690 after a political revolution we describe in the book, the Glorious Revolution, which enormously improved the accountability of the state, but which launched a project of developing state capacity, developing a fiscal system to raise taxes. Weren't people opposed to that? Yes, of course they were. The House of Commons, the Parliament, was full of aristocrats and lords. You know, if you've been in London, the whole of Westminster is still owned by the Duke of Westminster. He's the richest man in England. Okay? His ancestors were in the House of Commons. Were they opposed to taxation? Of course they were. So how did you deal with that problem? Well, the Duke of Westminster's main asset was land. This is the excise tax. This is a tax on consumption. What about the land tax? There was a land tax system too. The excise tax system was bureaucratized. The land tax system was never bureaucratized. The land tax withered away. Building a modern state, building a fiscal base, they had to make some compromises in Britain. And that was one of the compromises they built. Within the state itself, weren't the people like Musa Besai's people in Villas in Colombia? Sure there were. The state was full of people like that. It was full of relatives of politicians and politically appointed people who had no competence in the job. What did they do in Britain? Did they fire all those people? No, they didn't. They built the new excise tax bureaucracy alongside the old system. They grandfathered out the old bureaucracy in the same way they grandfathered out elite economic interests in a pre-modern fiscal system. This is a long time ago. You might think, why do I care what happened 300 years ago? Well, because this is the start of the development of an institutional complex that created the Industrial Revolution, that created all of the prosperity we see in the world today. So it's a particularly interesting institutional transition. And there's been a lot of talk about judicial reform and problems with the judiciary. This also established the independence of the judiciary at the same time. It created a completely new, separate, autonomous way of promoting and appointing and promoting judges. So here's an institutional transition. I could talk a lot more about that. I'm just trying to hint at some of the politics involved in this. Yes, there's always vested interests in extractive institutions. But the big picture, really, for me, is not that. The big picture is that there's no fundamental reason why Guatemala couldn't have the same level of income per capita and the same living standards as the United States. It just needs to reorganize its institutions to unlock all the latent talent in this society. Thank you.